A man's view of life must be available to him at all times and available as a sum, writes Leonard Peikoff. A man needs the integration, the all-embracing sweep, the vision of the universe. His fundamental conclusions must be condensed. He needs a concrete that can become an object of direct experience while carrying with it the meaning of his whole view of life, and that is the role of art. So welcome to week 33 of the Objectivism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibolt, and we are studying the first half of Chapter 12 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. So we'll be reading pages 413 to 437 today. The headings are the Introduction to Art, and then Art as a Concretization of Metaphysics, and then Romantic Literature as illustrating the role of philosophy in art. The theory of aesthetics, especially the aesthetics of literature, which is the form of fine art that deals most specifically in concepts. In this area, Ayn Rand is uniquely qualified to be a guide. She was a philosopher, but also an author of profoundly valuable works of fiction, especially The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Now we're in the final weeks of our survey of Ayn Rand's thought, and here we get to a topic that is also, as some of the others before, severely neglected within the intellectual life of many Christians, and indeed many pastors and many church leaders. So we're discussing the profound human need for beauty, for stories, heroes, drama, fiction, this whole world of human activity that makes this possible, the world of the fine arts. This week we'll be covering the larger part of the chapter, and so the next week we'll have extra time if we would like to discuss Ayn Rand's aesthetic theory compared to Christianity. What does the Bible say about these issues? The history of Christian thought, what does it have to say about the role of art in human life? Now, to introduce the topic, I'd like to read a couple of passages from Leonard Peikoff. This will be on page 415 if you're following along. Man needs to know on some level, what is the nature of the world in which I am acting, and what am I capable of doing in this world? What is the actor capable of? So he quotes Ayn Rand. He says, "Is the universe intelligible to man, or unintelligible and unknowable? Can man find happiness on earth, or is he doomed to frustration and despair? Does man have power to direct the course of his life, or is he the helpless plaything of forces beyond his control, which determine his fate? Is man by nature to be valued as good, or to be despised as evil?" Peikoff explains this category of questions is metaphysical. The issue raised is not by what rules should a man live, but in effect, can man live? Peikoff points out that this issue is logically prior, and it affects all of man's specific choices and rules. Fine art concerns itself with what Rand calls metaphysical value judgments. This is a category of questions that form the foundation for moral values. Such judgments can be conveyed by a work of art, by its subject, and by its style. Now, what is art? Art is, in Rand's definition, a selective recreation of reality, according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments. The artist shows us how he sees the world, or would want to see it, and he does this by selectivity. He chooses a subject to portray. He chooses his means to portray it. He helps us see something that he considers important in life, worthy of contemplation, whether that would be a good thing, an evil thing, a beautiful thing, an ugly thing, a combination, for a purpose that meets a human need. And we'll discuss that need in the reading. So when Ayn Rand talks about fine arts, she is discussing the main 5 fine arts that are recognized historically in Western Europe, which would be painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and poetry, but then expand poetry, that last term, to include also literature such as plays, works of fiction, and even cinema. So there are other forms that will come later that are going to combine some of the aspects. Like, for example, cinema typically has music, but it also has a literary component. It's a expansion of an idea that you could find in literature. Ayn Rand once pointed out something made by an artist is not the definition of art. To be called art, something needs to be a certain kind of thing. So the philosophical branch that studies this question is called aesthetics. It concerns itself with what art is not. Also, what are the standards to judge a specific work of art? Ayn Rand's views on art are not as startling and jarring to Christians as her views on motivation. If we as Christians try to look at motivation and her rational egoism theory, we find that surprising. At least most of us do, given the way that Christian thought is right now in the world. When we look at her theory of politics, we think this is not the normal theory of politics. This is not the way that most people in the world, and especially most Christians, would think about these issues. We get to her theory of aesthetics, and we find probably much more in common with her. So this should be fairly easy to understand what she's claiming. And also, it's true that her theory of aesthetics does not depend for its comprehension on already accepting her theory, say, of ethics. You could evaluate this, and you could just say, is her theory of aesthetics reasonable? Is there basis for it? A lot of what she's doing is looking at the history of literature. She's going to look at the kinds of stories that were told in different eras, the classical approach to plays versus the romantic novelists, versus after that would come the more realist school and then the postmodern schools. She's going to look at those things and say this is what the problems were in each of them, but this is what was perhaps good about some of them. She's going to agree with most Christians or most traditionalists in her analysis of postmodernism. She's going to say that's simply not art. It's not just bad art, it's not art. As a Christian coming to this, or even as just a traditionalist coming to Rand's views on these issues, you're going to have a basic agreement with her on the common sense level of analysis of the history. If you look at the direction that art is going, if you look to analyze what already exists in the world, you're going to probably have very similar analysis to Rand. And so what is unique in her is her explanation for why it is so. Rand does have useful and original ideas about art and art theory. Her ideas form a good complement to what has been thought worthwhile about these topics within the history of Western Christian society. Christians have always understood the importance of beauty and the importance of the fine arts. This is part of our faith tradition. So Christianity has always been inseparable from these things because we hold that God is the creator of the world, the creator of beauty. Also, he has created us to be creators because we are in his image. We share this in common with him. We are creators. And when we look at the history of Christianity, some things stand out. First of all, at the core of Christianity is the Bible. It's a central value in our belief system. And the Bible is a work of literature. It's also a chronicle, a work of history, but it has poetry, it has wisdom literature, and it has narrative, and it has epistles. And the point, though, is that each one of these has beauty in a different way, and they are all literature. They're more than literature, but they're not less than that. So we have, in agreement with Rand, a strong appreciation for literature as being the most conceptual of the fine arts. Now, beyond that, in the accounts that we have in the Bible, it would be impossible to imagine a group of people that are God's people not singing songs to God to worship him, not exalting him. And so we have within Christianity and within the lives of Christians or the ancient Jewish people before, we have this pattern of celebrating what we consider to be most worthy of celebration. We establish this is what a hero is. This is what is praiseworthy. We sing of God. We sing of how wonderful he is. Moses, as he had taken the people across the Red Sea, sings to the people, and the people sing. We'll praise the Lord because he's thrown the horse and the rider into the sea, because he's saved the people. We see a huge emphasis on song within Christianity and within the history of our religion. And that goes through Martin Luther, that goes through the Catholic Church. The history of Western music, classical music, is the history of religious music, and how the kind of forms of music that were sung in the church developed into the ideas about music, which could be used in other contexts. Some background, I studied music education, and so for me, the aspect of art history that is most interesting is, of course, music. And so that will contrast well with Rand, because Rand considered the history of music and the aesthetics of music to be perhaps the most difficult. And the reason is because it's not the most directly translatable into words, into concepts. But I do find that what Rand says on music and on aesthetic theory applied to music is incredibly insightful. We won't have time to discuss that in the video today, but you can find it in a book that she has called The Romantic Manifesto. She discusses piece by piece, what does her theory have to say about sculpture? What does it have to say about poetry, about literature, about music, architecture, and painting as well? I would recommend that. The chapter that we have here today from Leonard Peikoff is just the most philosophical summary of Rand's work on this, and you have a complete introduction to Rand's theory in a whole book, The Romantic Manifesto. If you're interested in art at all, it's worth going into. I think that some of her finest writing is in that book. Her views on philosophy in general are contained in part in that book. So if you're interested in Rand's thought, that's indispensable. We see as Christians an emphasis on beauty, an emphasis on craftsmanship and fine arts throughout the history of our religion and our history of our encounter as a people with God. So think about when God calls people out of Egypt, one of the first things he does is establishes that there's going to be a tabernacle and there's going to be a set of rituals and symbols around that tabernacle. Eventually that becomes the temple. The amount of detail that we see describing how that tabernacle and then later how that temple were created gives us an indication that God considered this important. He even told them specifically the dimensions, what kind of decorations to have, what color to use. So these questions of beauty, these questions of form are a concern not only to man, but also to God. We see throughout the history of the church a continual emphasis on that. The building of cathedrals, churches were considered to be a place of worship, and so they had to be a place of beauty. This was considered to be common sense. Within those churches, the cathedrals, these were places not only for contemplation of the physical beauty, but also the auditory experience. A cathedral was designed to be a place where you could hear a small group of singers and it would resound throughout the whole cathedral. And it would create this heavenly sense, this otherworldly transcendent sense. This sense comes from the sound of the reverberation of the building, but also from the height of the building and the way that light came through the use of stained glass. So we have examples in Christian history of a huge emphasis on the visual arts and the auditory arts, and then eventually even in the dramatic arts. So different times of the year, the church was willing to put to music different scenes from the Bible. And religious drama within the church eventually expanded into what we would later see as the art of opera and then musical theater. That is the origin of even what we see today. If you go to watch a Broadway musical, or if you see a movie that is a musical, like a Disney movie, all of that traces back to the forms of literature, these forms of drama. As Christians, we look at Rand's comments now on this, and we're going to compare what she has to say, her theory of what makes art art, and also what the best kinds of art are. So as we're looking in the book today, I'm not going to have a ton of criticism of her view because I generally accept it. She's talking as a historian of art and sharing what art is and what made certain works of art in history good or bad. And I think that we can find a lot of agreement with her. So let's go into the book. We are now on page 413. So Peikoff addresses this question of why is the philosophy of art considered to be a core aspect of an entire philosophy? It's not a derivative aspect. So he says law, education, psychology, physics, they all have philosophies. You could have a philosophy of education. You could have a philosophy of law. But he says, so those are different professional branches. You need some philosophical approach to a professional branch. But this is a branch of philosophy proper. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy proper. It's different from philosophy of law. It's more fundamental. The reason why he would say it's more fundamental is because it's universal and it's timeless. All human beings at all times need art. It's different for, say, the philosophy of medicine. Everybody benefits or should benefit from beauty. And so we need an answer for what is this human experience that we all have and that we all ought to be pursuing. So he says that art is an intellectual need of man qua man. Now he says, beside the need of a view of the universe covered by metaphysics, the method of knowledge, epistemology, and a code of values, ethics and politics, the only other need within the province of pure philosophy is art. So top of the next page, he says, art is a need of the mind, i.e. of a man qua thinker and valuer. That is why, like philosophy itself, art has always existed among men. There's always been, as far as even like the people that lived in caves, you see art in the caves. Why? There's a need to look at the world and then to select something that you think is most meaningful to you and then to represent it, to recreate it. Art is a concretization of metaphysics. In other words, you're looking at what is the overall, the broadest thing that you could say about the world and my place in it. A work of art is an end in itself in the sense that it serves no purpose beyond man's contemplation of it. You may have heard this term, art for art's sake. Well, it's art for man's sake, so just to be clear on that. But it's not for the sake of being able to accomplish some other end. It's for the sake of the experience. A scientific treatise or a machine or a busy signal on the telephone, these are means to a utilitarian goal, writes Peikoff. But a novel, a statue, a symphony are not. The purpose is the experience itself, not something else after it. Objectivism holds, says Peikoff, that art does have a purpose, a rational, worldly, practical purpose. Art fulfills an essential need in human life, not a material need. That's the distinction. It's a spiritual need that art fulfills. So this is quoting Rand. Art is inextricably tied to man's survival, not to his physical survival, but to that on which his physical survival depends, to the preservation and survival of his consciousness. So it's spiritual, it's pertaining to consciousness. So Peikoff writes at the bottom of this 414, since a conceptual consciousness is an integrating mechanism, it requires the ultimate integration of its contents that is provided by philosophy. We've seen this in the entire book we've just read. A conceptual being needs context, principles, long-range direction. He needs connection among his goals, coherence among his days, a broad overview, uniting his disparate experiences, conclusions, and actions into a sum. Now, philosophy does provide this. So Peikoff goes on, he writes, to achieve such integration, a man needs a code of ethics. Above all, he needs that on which ethics rests, a perspective on existence as such. So the perspective on existence as such is a metaphysical question. He needs a view not only of work, of friends, or of food, but of life. So he needs metaphysical conclusions. He needs them precisely to the extent that he does function as a man rather than an animal. So there are metaphysical questions that every person has some answer to, either explicitly or implicitly. So for example, is the universe intelligible? That's going to affect how you choose to live your life, if you answer yes or no. Can man find happiness on earth? Do I have the power of choice? Is my nature essentially evil, or am I essentially good, but with some evil? These are the kinds of questions that any person needs to ask. On this, I agree with Peikoff. These are metaphysical questions. As a human being, you have to have some thoughts on this. The role of art is to take those thoughts and to present them to you, not merely as a list of different observations that you've made or analyses, but rather as a sum, some kind of picture in your mind of who you are. And so these questions, these metaphysical value judgments, need to be condensed so that when you go, say, for example, you have a hard day at work and you're going to do some specific task, you have a picture of who you are as a person and what you're capable of doing, what the options really are. These need to be available to you as a sum. The role of art is to present you with a picture of what that looks like. So for instance, you've seen a painting, say a painting of a scene of 2 or 3 people enjoying a picnic. You've seen a painting like that. You have a picture in your mind of what it would be like for people to have a life where things are beautiful. Now, as you are in the middle of some challenge in life, you have that picture. It doesn't have to be, I go and I say to myself, I want to achieve that status, that situation in that picture. Rather, it's you remember there is such thing as goodness in life. There is such thing as a state of rest or fulfillment. I believe that's possible because I've seen it. So having seen a painting or having thought about a story that had a happy ending, you have now in your life this almost like a concrete of this is where I am headed. This is my destination. I know that that is possible in my life. When you're faced with a moral challenge, somebody says to you, well, we should do it this way. We should take a shortcut. And you know that that's not moral, that you should take some kind of shortcut. You have in your own consciousness a picture of, say, some hero. Maybe it's John Wayne or Gary Cooper, some present movie star, or even it could be something from a comic book, or it could be one of Ayn Rand's heroes from her novels. But the point is you have a picture in your mind of some kind of person that acts a certain way characteristically. For a Christian, that would very clearly be Jesus Christ and his followers, the apostles, or someone like Moses or David or Samuel. You're going to imagine, what does a good person do? Instead of thinking a good person has all these 9 different fruits of the Spirit, you're going to have a summarized picture in your mind of this is what Jesus would have actually done in this situation. This is what John the Baptist would have done in this situation, or Paul the Apostle. A person, a hero in your mind becomes a tangible concrete that you can see more clearly than just these lists of descriptions. For example, if you're familiar with Ayn Rand's work, the character of Howard Rourke. Howard Rourke is intransigent. He is an individualist. He always wants his work done on his terms. So suppose that you're in a situation where somebody says, I like what you created here, but I want to modify it this way and this way and this way. In your mind, you might be able to come up with an argument for why it's necessary morally for you to stick to your principles and not change the kind of work that you're doing to something else that you don't believe in. But your explicit philosophizing is one thing. Your ability to look at Howard Rourke as a hero and an example that you'd want to follow is a whole different thing, isn't it? So what Rand is saying here is that there is a need not only for philosophy, but also for art, because art holds up for us a model of what we are trying to be. And so when I think, okay, Howard Rourke, what would he do? That's a whole different experience in my mind than what follows morally from an analysis of the situation. I can say to myself, compromising on my values would turn me more into Peter Keating, not Howard Rourke, but I like Howard Rourke. It's as simple as that. It's almost like you can think in terms of analogies rather than having to think in terms of the specifics of every single intellectual issue. Compare what an essay does for your life versus what Howard Rourke does for your life. Or thinking more from the Christian point of view, what does, say, an epistle from Paul do for your life versus what does the thought of the narrative of Jesus on the cross and then coming out of the tomb and then ascending? That is different because this is visual. It's different from Paul's letters where he explains what we should do in whatever situation morally. It's a vision. It's a vision of something that is worthy of praise. It's different from your abstractions. It's abstractions made concrete. So Peikoff writes, for action, a man needs the integration, the all-embracing sweep, the vision of the universe. He needs a concrete that can become an object of direct experience while carrying with it the meaning of his whole view of life, and this is the role of art. Everybody throughout history has always had some songs, stories, dances, buildings, paintings or drawings. Everyone has always thought it was necessary to take the experience of human life and put it into a form that is tangible. Art, in Ayn Rand's definition, is a selective recreation of reality, according to an artist's metaphysical value judgments. Peikoff writes he uses isolation and integration in regard to those aspects of reality which represent man's fundamental view of himself and existence. Out of the countless number of concretes, of single, disorganized, seemingly contradictory attributes, actions, and entities, an artist isolates the things which he regards as metaphysically essential and integrates them into a single new concrete that represents an embodied abstraction. All the way going back to the cave paintings, where it's stick figures of hunters. What is the artist saying? Is the artist saying merely, one day we did this? He's not. He's saying something more profound than that. He's saying, we are the people who do this. This is how we see ourselves. Peikoff writes that an artist selects out of the bewildering chaos of human experience those aspects he regards as indicative of the nature of the universe. Then he embodies them in a sensory perceptual concrete, such as a statue, a painting, a story. The result is a universe in microcosm. Reminds me of a series of piano exercises by a composer from about 100 years ago named Bela Bartok, Microcosmos. Each little song is like its own little universe. It's a way of experiencing the world, a way of feeling and thinking. So the result is a view of the universe in the form of a deliberately slanted concrete, one shorn of all irrelevancies and thus broadcasting unmistakably to the reader or viewer, this is what counts in life, as I, the artist, see life. We're going over to page 418 now. Peikoff has some description here of some reasons why you need this. He says, you see something about a society's vision of itself and the world from a statue, or from a story, or from a song. The message that you get from those is different from the message that you get from, say, a speech or an essay. Compare different paintings you may have seen of Adam and Eve. Have you seen different paintings of them? Some of them show Adam and Eve as healthy, strong, happy. Some of them show them as poor posture, kind of misshapen. If you think of some of the paintings by Michelangelo, some of them show Adam and Eve after the fall, ungainly, kind of awkward in their shape. The color is pale and sickly, and they seem unhappy in their faces, a certain view of who mankind actually are. Even the most famous creation of Adam, the man Adam has reached out his finger, but he's sort of fainting. He's falling backward, and his arm doesn't look like it's capable of reaching out to the full, and his finger is not even pointing straight up. It's pointing sort of down. And it's God that makes the connection. It's God that is in motion, whereas it is man that's static. Well, these are metaphysical value judgments being conveyed, that man is in a helpless state. It is God who comes and saves and reconnects, even though the connection has been broken. Well, if you think about that, or if you think about the depictions of Adam and Eve being told to leave the garden, the despair on their faces, that is a view of man. It is a metaphysical value judgment about what our experience is as human beings. It's not a judgment that Ayn Rand would agree with, but the point that we would agree on with Rand is that that is a picture of an assertion about reality. You compare various illustrations that you may have seen of Jesus Christ even. Some of them would treat him as weak and in despair. Some of them would show him as triumphant and glorious. And I know to our Presbyterian friends, the depiction of Jesus, the Son of God at all, is considered to be in poor taste or even violating the commandments. But every work of art tells a story. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why do they choose to tell that story? The artist is telling you something about himself and about how he sees the world. So Peikoff writes, an artwork does not formulate the metaphysics that it represents. It doesn't present it analytically. It doesn't articulate definitions and principles. That's philosophy's job. But philosophy has its own limitations. So philosophy by itself, Peikoff writes, cannot satisfy man's need of philosophy. It's kind of an odd statement. Philosophy by itself cannot satisfy man's need of philosophy. Something else has to come alongside philosophy in order to turn the philosophy abstractions into concretes that man can understand in a unified way. Remember the unit economy principle from epistemology. So man requires the union of philosophy and art, says Peikoff, the broad identifications and their concrete embodiment. And so there we have an important formulation from Ayn Rand. She says art is a concretization of metaphysics. Art brings man's concepts to the perceptual level of his consciousness and allows him to grasp them directly as if they were percepts. This is the psycho-epistemological function of art, and the reason of its importance in man's life, and it's the crux of the objectivist ethics. That's why we have art. That's its role in human life. There's a section here discussing what Rand means by psycho-epistemology. She means your characteristic method of thought, an important term that you could acquaint yourself with. Rand speaks of it somewhat frequently. Going now to the sort of the bottom of page 419, by converting abstractions into percepts, art performs another crucial and inseparable function. It not only integrates metaphysics, but it also objectifies it. That means it enables man to contemplate his view of the world in the form of an existential object. So when you look at, let us just say, that picture of Adam with God reaching down to man to touch his finger, you can experience that and say, what is this saying? But then you can also take a step back. Now it is objective. You can say, is this true? You can ask yourself, is this way of seeing the world consonant with the facts that I know from observation and from my study? It's an existential object. So Rand writes, to acquire the full persuasive, irresistible power of reality, man's metaphysical abstractions have to confront him in the form of concretes, in the form of art. The point there is that you may have analyzed and made your arguments and statements, but until there is something that you can see as a concrete, your journey of establishing your philosophy is not complete. Okay, go to the top of page 420. Now let us consider the condensing and objectifying function of art as it applies to another branch of philosophy, ethics. We had talked about the metaphysical value judgments. Now let's talk about ethical value judgments. So one must know a series of separately identified moral rules and also their integration. It's art that will help us with the integration. This is why when we see in literature there are heroes, why those heroes matter to us. On a philosophical level, this is the answer to why heroes are important for human life. In Rand's work, we have Howard Rourke, we have John Galt, and they are crucially important. Peikoff writes, an ethical treatise alone does not give man the moral guidance that he needs, nor does the image of a hero do so, but the union of the two does give it. Art, Miss Rand concludes, is the indispensable medium for the communication of a moral ideal. As a Christian, I think, wow, this is exactly what the Bible is doing, because we have a combination of Jesus's teachings and sermons, and then we have the letters of the apostles, but then we also have the account of the Acts of the Apostles. We also have the gospel narratives. So we know what the people did. We also know what they taught. And it's when you look at those two things in conjunction with each other that you come to a theology, an overall outlook. We benefit not only from hearing what Jesus said about various questions, but from seeing Jesus in action. That tells us something that we wouldn't get only from a quote, only from an essay. Seeing him in action is an essential part of forming our total view of who we ought to be, because he's our hero. Now, at the bottom of this page, the essential field in this context is literature. Why? Well, Peikoff wants to talk about literature more than the other forms because literature deals in concepts. Literature deals in accounts of things that have happened in terms of words. Painting is kind of like that, except for a painting captures something of a story, but it also has other aspects to it. Contrast of the colors and the light and the dark and the shape and the patterns visually. Those are almost more musical aspects of the painting, aren't they? And then if you get even more into abstractions, music is more abstract even than a painting because it's not representing anything, whereas a painting does represent. But in terms of representation, a novel represents much more than a painting can. And so it's much more in the conceptual realm. The related forms, not just novels, poetry, and film, theater, these are the related forms. We'd call them all literature in general, or at least they're partially literature. Those are the category that they're going to discuss in the remainder of this chapter. So we go to page 421. To a rational man, art that objectivizes metaphysics provides a unique kind of inspiration. It is an indispensable source of emotional fuel. A man cannot live only in the future. He needs a moment of rest, quoting Ayn Rand, in which he can experience the sense of his completed task, the sense of living in a universe where his values have been successfully achieved. So like I mentioned earlier of this painting, where there's several people out in nature on a picnic. You see the painting, it gives you a sense of peace. It makes you realize that your life has moments like that too, and that they are worth working toward. So art can give man the pleasure of feeling what it would be like to live in his ideal world. The fuel involved is the life-giving fact of experiencing a moment of metaphysical joy, a moment of love for existence. Not the only experience that you might get from a work of art. I know there are some medieval works of art that look like they belong in a horror movie. But when you enter into that world, when you look at Bosch, you look at some of his almost like surrealist paintings, but they were from the Middle Ages, you see a world of chaos. You experience the world in that way, and you ask yourself, is this the way the world is? Now, I don't think that that is the way I experience the world, but it perhaps would be if you were in hell. It could be an important piece of art, even if it's not aesthetically pleasing work of art. It could be great art, even if it's not pleasing. When you enter into the world of this or that art, you experience what it would be like if the whole world was of a certain kind, of a certain style. Bottom of this page, when an artwork objectifies his metaphysics, the reader or viewer experiences a confirmation of his mind and self on the deepest level. The perceptual concrete functions as an affirmation from one reality of the efficacy of his consciousness. If you've seen The Wanderer Over the Sea of Fog, that famous painting, if you've ever felt that you were alone and that you were willing to go into this unknown, and you were willing to look further than anyone else had looked, and you were willing to stand alone in the emptiness of nature, and you see that painting, and you think, I've felt that way before. It's an affirmation of how you see the world. It's an affirmation of your consciousness, not just of your existence, but of your mind as well. So your grasp of the world is right. You are right. That may be the experience you get when you look at that painting. Peikoff goes on, imagine if you saw a painting that was dissonant with your view of the world, then the experience you might have as reality is not what I think it is. My values are a delusion. I am wrong. There's something wrong with me. If you've ever looked at Salvador Dali's paintings, the surrealist, he's very talented, but the worldview that he portrays is not my worldview. And when I look at his paintings, I think either he's wrong or I'm wrong. Either he sees the world wrong or I see the world wrong. It's a dissonant feeling. Not to say that it can't be a valuable experience to look at his works, but there is a dissonance there, isn't there? That's contained in what is portrayed in the art itself, but also it can be related to how it's portrayed. There's the what, but then there's also the how. This is going to be true for any work of art. There's what is the thing, but then also in what way is it done? So for example, a song that is a famous jazz standard could be played in a different style one day and then the next. The how becomes important as well. In a work of literature, there could be the same sequence of events, but the way that the story is told also matters. The how also matters. So now we get to this other topic that is related. It is the subject of style. So far, he's been considering the subject of the artwork, or what it presents, the perceptual concretes that convey its view of the world. But there's another essential aspect to art, the style, the how. The subject of an artwork, Rand writes, expresses a view of man's existence. But the style represents the view of man's consciousness. Go back to that illustration of the cave painting. If you were to ask yourself, what is the subject of this work of art? It's men hunting bison, and they have spears, and they're throwing, and they're giving chase. But what is the style? The style could have been totally different. In this case, the style is stick figures, and the bison are not particularly naturalistic. They look like blobs. They don't look super realistic, but there is a sense of motion conveyed. There is a sense of color. The choices that the artist made, the way he did it, the way he chose to when he could have chose to do it differently. That is the style. Quote of Rand: "An artist's style may express a state of full focus, of clarity, of purpose, precision, or a state of fog, of the opaque, the random, the blurred." In the visual arts, it's very easy to differentiate between the styles. If you were to say, look at some of the most true to life sculptures that you've seen in classical Greek sculpture, if you were to compare that to some of the visual arts of, say, the Mayans, and in the Mayans, there's more of a highly stylized, not realistic proportions. It looks more like a cartoon, but it's all within a certain visual vocabulary so that there's a unity to it. These are all worth appreciating. They all tell us something about the people that created them. That's style. So it tells us about how the mind operates, how the mind of this person operates. And if you see a style that you can appreciate, what you experience is an affirmation of your consciousness. Yes, I can see the world that way. I can feel that way about it. Rand, in her book, The Romantic Manifesto, gives an extended example of style in literature. And I think that we'll just depart from Peikoff's book for just a moment and go into Rand's book. And I want to share with you points that they make about style. Rand writes, "Let us compare the literary style of two excerpts from two different novels, reproduced below. Both are descriptions of the same subject, New York City at night. Observe which one of them recreates the visual reality of a specific scene, and which one deals with vague emotional assertions and floating abstractions." So the first excerpt, and this is, by the way, this is the one that she appreciates more. "Nobody ever walked across the bridge, not on a night like this. The rain was misty enough to be almost fog-like. A cold gray curtain that separated me from the pale ovals of white that were faces locked behind the steamed-up windows of the cars that hissed by. Even the brilliance that was Manhattan at night was reduced to a few sleepy yellow lights off in the distance. Someplace over there I left my car and started walking, burying my head in the collar of my raincoat. With the night pulled in around me like a blanket, I walked and I smoked and I flipped the spent butts ahead of me and watched them arch to the pavement and fizzle out with one last wink." So that's the first excerpt. Second excerpt. "That hour, that moment, in that place, struck with a peerless coincision upon the very heart of his own youth, the crest and zenith of his own desire. The city had never seemed as beautiful as it looked that night. For the first time he saw that New York was supremely among the cities of the world, the city of the night. There had been achieved here a loveliness that was astounding and incomparable, a kind of modern beauty, inherent to its place and time, that no other place nor time could match. He realized suddenly that the beauty of other cities of the night, of Paris, spread below from the butte of Sacré-Cœur to its vast, mysterious blossoms of nocturnal radiance of London, with its smoky nimbus of fogged light, which was so peculiarly thrilling because it was so vast, so lost in the illimitable, had each its own special quality, so lovely and mysterious, but had yet produced no beauty that could equal this." Okay, so the first excerpt, writes Rand, is by Mickey Spillane from his novel One Lonely Night. The second excerpt is by Thomas Wolfe from his novel The Web and the Rock. Let me just give you Rand's thoughts, and I agree with it completely. She writes, "Both writers had to recreate a visual scene and convey a certain mood. Observe the difference in their methods. There is not a single emotional word or adjective in Spillane's description. He presents nothing save visual facts, but he selects only those facts, only those eloquent details which convey the visual reality of the scene and create a mood of desolate loneliness. Wolfe does not describe the city. He does not give us a single characteristic visual detail. He asserts that the city is, quote, beautiful, but he does not tell us what makes it beautiful. Such words as beautiful, astounding, incomparable, thrilling, lovely are estimates. In the absence of any indication of what aroused these estimates, these are arbitrary assertions and meaningless generalities." I'll just cut in. You notice that what Wolfe is doing is describing his own feelings about what he's seeing, whereas what Spillane was doing was describing things that the character in the scene would have actually looked at and seen. That's the major difference. Wolfe attempted to make you feel a certain way by telling you how to feel, whereas Spillane shows you what he saw that made him feel a certain way. And now that he shows you what he saw, you feel that same way. And that's the role of selectivity. All right, so I'm going to read on in Ayn Rand's words. She says, "Spillane's style is reality-oriented, addressed to an objective psychoepistemology. He provides the facts and expects the reader to react accordingly. Wolfe's style is emotion-oriented and addressed to a subjective psychoepistemology. He expects the reader to accept emotions divorced from facts, to accept them secondhand. Spillane has to be read in focus, because the reader's own mind has to estimate the given facts and evoke an appropriate emotion. If one reads him out of focus, one gets nothing. There are no loose, ready-made generalizations, no pre-digested emotions. If one reads Wolf out of focus, one gets a vague, grandiloquent approximation, suggesting he has said something important or uplifting. If one reads him in full focus, one sees that he has said nothing. These are not the only attributes of a literary style. I have used these examples only to indicate some very broad categories, writes Rand. A great many other elements are involved in these two excerpts and in any piece of writing. Style is the most complex aspect of literature and psychologically the most revealing. That's what I wanted to read from the Romantic Manifesto. There's so much more like this, of like quality. Rand also does some analysis of her own writing and says, here's how I wrote it, and then here's, if I were writing it badly, here's what I would have done. There's a lot in there. And I want to point you not only to Rand's book, The Romantic Manifesto, but also her other work called The Art of Fiction, which is an adaptation of a series of lectures on how she approaches the task of writing fiction. This will be valuable to you if you are a writer, but also if you are not ever planning to write, if you just want to appreciate fiction more, to know what goes into making good fiction. This will help you see what the writer is doing and what you ought to be doing as a reader as you engage with literature. So definitely check out those two books, philosophically and specifically aesthetically important. So that's what I wanted to read to you about Mickey Spillane and about Thomas Wolfe's story as well. And if you've ever read Ayn Rand and her fiction, you'll see which one she's more like. She shows you what the characters see, and she's so selective in what she sees. She always tells you something about the person that you could actually see, or about the scene that you could actually see. But she chooses the detail that automatically brings you to a certain evaluation or emotion. In other words, she's being objective. She's showing you the facts that gives rise to a certain assessment or a certain concept. Bottom of page 422, Peikoff writes that the role of art is not didactic, an important point, especially if you've looked at the kind of art that's coming out of Disney Plus lately or something like that, where it's all propaganda. Now, people have accused Rand of being propaganda because her art has so many explicitly described value judgments. But that's not the same thing as what we're talking about when we say propaganda. Pre-chewed, pre-formulated, just sort of spat out. So this is what Peikoff says. Even when art does project a moral ideal, its goal is not to teach men that ideal. So the question here is not so much about whether or not there are ideals, but what the goal is. Is the goal to teach versus is the goal simply to show, to portray? Peikoff writes, the purpose of art is not education or proselytizing, neither in regard to ethics nor to metaphysics. To teach these subjects is the task of philosophy. And I would argue as well, it's also the task of theology. Peikoff doesn't have a place for that. But going on, for which art is not a substitute, and artwork is not a textbook or a propaganda vehicle. The basic purpose of art, writes Rand, is not to teach but to show, to hold up to man a concretized image of his nature and to place it in the universe. Peikoff writes, the task of art is not to present conceptual information, but to provide man with a definite experience. That's what we've been saying the whole time. This is what reality is like. Peikoff writes, one can learn a great deal about life from a work of art, from its philosophy and theme, just as Miss Rand notes. One can learn a great deal about flying by dismantling and studying an airplane, but in both cases, the knowledge one gains is a fringe benefit, not a primary. The purpose of a plane, as of an artwork, is not to provide material for a classroom, but to do something. The purpose is to make possible to men a certain kind of action, in this case, a certain kind of experience. Another quote from Rand here in the middle, it says, art conditions or stylizes man's consciousness by conveying to him a certain way of looking at existence. And in order to convey it, writes Peikoff, an artwork, as already stated, must be a selective recreation of reality. You saw in the details in the illustration from Mickey Spillane the selectivity. He talked about the bridge, and there was a night where the rain was misty, almost fog-like, and then there were pale ovals of white that were faces behind the steamed-up windows of the cars that hissed by. So there's details that you could observe, the cars hissing, the pale faces. These are things that you would experience if you were there. But he selected those details in order to convey the sense of loneliness that he intended. Bottom of page 423. Art is not an instrument of literal reproduction. Peikoff writes that art reports the way things are metaphysically. The artist therefore has to choose from observations. He has to slant the data, but in a calculated manner. And this is not an escape from reality. It's actually a unique form of attentiveness to reality, the parts of reality that are important. Top of page 424, an artwork tells man not that something is, but that it is important. And important here is not a synonym with good. Evil can be important, writes Peikoff. Important, according to one dictionary, denotes a standing such as to entitle to attention or consideration. And the only fundamental entitled to man's attention, Miss Rand holds, is reality. So important is essentially a metaphysical term. Cognitive abstractions are formed by the criterion of what is essential. Normative abstractions are formed by the criterion of what is good. Aesthetic abstractions are formed by the criterion of what is important. And this explains why a story ending that involves tragedy or a story that has sadness can be good art. Everything in a work of art, from theme to subject to brush stroke or adjective, acquires metaphysical significance by the mere fact of being included, being important enough to include. So Rand gives this example of a painting of a beautiful woman, but she has a cold sore. If you had a painting in your house of a beautiful woman with a cold sore, you would be making a specific statement, a judgment about the way life is, wouldn't you? It would be a message. The message is that beauty is futile. The attempt at beauty is ridiculous. Similarly, if you have a TV show where the joke is on the hero all the time, or a TV show where happy endings are avoided on principle, that's sort of a message about the way the world is, isn't it? It's a message about what is metaphysically significant. Rand does not say that all stories have to have a happy ending, but the point here is that you are going to be selective, and what you select is important. It's going to tell you something about your judgments. In life, one ignores the unimportant, but in art, one omits it, writes Rand. Middle of page 426. So art gives you a sense of yourself and the world. A conceptual consciousness, even a concrete bound one, cannot escape making in some form broad generalizations about life. If a man characteristically chooses to be mentally active, that will lead him to a sense of efficacy and optimism, to a benevolent universe. This idea that values can be achieved in the world. And then Rand observes, a generalized feeling about existence, an implicit metaphysics with the compelling motivational power of a constant, basic emotion, an emotion which is part of all his other emotions and underlies his experiences. This is a sense of life. Rand has this whole concept called a sense of life that is your underlying emotional environment of your personality. There's actually a documentary that I'd recommend to check out. It's called Ayn Rand, A Sense of Life, and it goes more into that. So each artist has a sense of life, writes Rand. It directs their choices that they make about what should be in their art. Peikoff writes, art is inherently philosophical, even if those who create it and respond to it are not. So everyone conveys their sense of life, whether they mean to or not. It just happens. Objectivism offers a rational aesthetics. It ties art to the faculty of reason. And we're going to see in the next discussion, which will start next week, how it shows that the root of art is not some mystic power that prostrates man's cognitive faculty, but the exact opposite. And it shows that the root of the power of art is man's conceptual faculty. So we'll get to Romanticism next week. I will just add that those who are interested in learning Ayn Rand's ideas on aesthetics in more depth, Peikoff's chapter here, I've just been summarizing it, but the chapter is worth careful study. But also look at the Romantic Manifesto on the topic of aesthetics. You're going to get a lot more material. And look at her book, The Art of Fiction. So Rand was not the first major thinker on the topic of aesthetics, but I will say I've studied music in college, looked for serious books on aesthetics. It's been very difficult to find good work on this. So I highly recommend Rand. To see how good she is, I want to read this quote to you from Dr. Benjamin Mabry. This is the way most people talk about aesthetics. He says, at its core, aesthetics are the exterior manifestation of excellence in culture and identity. The signifiers that a man sees himself as different from others and participates in a social environment of his own kind. Aesthetics are a self-presentation that asserts to others that a person belongs to a particular context and declares loyalty to a community and its principles. Look, if I wanted to make a parody of collectivist academics and the empty rhetoric they employ, I would do no better than Benjamin Mabry. But Rand offers something different. She offers her premises, which are individualistic, not collectivistic. She looks at reality, she sees reasons, she discovers identity, and she shows you why art has identity. Good art has identity. And that's what we're going to discuss next week as we discuss how aesthetic value is objective. God bless.